It's so good to see everyone for tonight's author talk with one of this year's Read Me featured authors, Morgan Talty. It's very exciting. I'm Nicole Rancourt with the Maine Humanities Council, and I'm here with my colleague.
I'm Gibson Fail-LeBlanc from the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, and we are missing our third tonight, Allison Maxwell from the Maine State Library, who is with us in spirit.
So what is Read Me? Each year we partner to bring Read Me, which is a summer community reads program featuring Maine authors to public libraries and their communities across the state.
And this summer, celebrated Maine author Colin Woodard recommended Megan Gillis's Lungfish and Morgan Talty's Night of the Living Rez as must-reads. So if you're interested in checking these books out, reach out to your local public library. We have over 60 libraries around the state participating this year.
So before we hand things fully over to you and Morgan this evening, I just want to cover a few things. We are indeed recording this event and in the hopes of making the archive available to everyone. We're also connecting to Facebook Live. Hello, everybody on Facebook. For those of you joining via Zoom, if you have questions, you can pop them into the chat, just type them right in there. We'll be monitoring that for the evening. For those on Facebook, just pop your questions into the comment area. I'll be there kind of hanging out, checking in, and I'll make sure that they get moved from there into Zoom. And as you all know, I always remind everyone that we are in a rural state, and even sometimes when you're in a more urban suburban area, internet connectivity is a little wobbly. So if one of us disappears, we will do our best to get back here. The waiting room is off, so if you disappear, you should be able to get right back in clicking the link that you started with. If you have any other questions, you can directly message me, Nicole. Otherwise, I'm gonna just get things rolling. I'll pass it to you, Gibson.
Great, and I'm gonna get right to the main event. We're here tonight to talk with Morgan Talty. Morgan is a citizen of the Penobscot Indian Nation and the author of the nationally best-selling and critically acclaimed story collection, Night of the Living Rez, which won the New England Book Award, was a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers, finalist for the 2023 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, finalist for the Story Prize, also the Penn Robert Bingham Prize for Debut Story Collection. His writing has appeared all over and has won the Narrative Prize from Narrative Magazine. And Morgan is an assistant professor of English and creative writing and Native American and Contemporary Literature at the University of Maine at Orono. And he's on the faculty at Stone Coast MFA, where he did his MFA, and as well as at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And he is the prose editor of Massachusetts Review. Morgan, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you too.
Yeah,
I need to shorten my my bio.
It's all good. It's all good. The book has done so well, and it's been such a pleasure to see that. And I have to say, it was really a big pleasure for me to, having read it last year, to reread those stories and just sink back into the world that the book creates. And that's actually, so I thought we would start there. And I was wondering, as I was reading and rereading, how I wonder if we could talk about how stories begin for you. Is there a usual way, I guess, is the first question. And does it start with an image or a line or a situation, or I don't know, something else that spark for you?
Yeah, I feel like it'll vary story to story. I think, sometimes, I probably, if I sat long enough with each of the stories in the collection, I could be like, okay, this is what prompted me to get this story going. But I used to, it's different now that I have a 5-month-old. But before, when I would wake up and sit and drink coffee and just sort of like absorb that quiet, before the harsh realities of life, take you on. I would just think, I would just sort of let myself go wherever I wanted to go. And, I would sometimes hear names, or I'd think of like interesting situations. And, so that would sometimes be, material that would get me going, get me started. Sometimes it would be, stuff that I had seen and I'd written down. For example, it could be an image, something I saw that was striking. And I keep a running list on my phone, like in my notes app. I have like a bunch of lines that I feel sound, or I think sound really nice or cool, or images that I think are cool. And one of them, for example, was the opening image of Earth Speak, which was at the top of the high hill, fog rested among the trees like fall webworms and the crooks of brown branches, or something like that. And that was an image I saw driving on I-95, and I told my wife Jordan, I was like, you got to write this down in my phone for me for later. And that became the way into the story. So it always varies. There's always this and sometimes you don't quite find that in right away. You it's a false start, you know what I mean? And sometimes you find your start at the end of the story that you think you just wrote.
Yeah. I was wondering about in particular, and if, maybe this is one, maybe not, but the opening image of the book is so striking with, Dee finding his friend Felis in the swamp with his hair frozen in the ice. Was that something that you knew did that happen to somebody, or did you just, yeah, I mean,
I can't give myself credit for that. I couldn't, I don't think, come up with that. Maybe I could, I don't know, but it was a friend told me about it, who he was non-native, and he heard it from this non-native guy who was actually the one who had cut the hair. He was walking somewhere, and I can't remember where it was in Maine, and he was crossing this bridge, and at the other side of it, there's a guy passed out in the snow, and he said, blank, is that you? And he lifted his head up and he said exactly verbatim, what's in the story, F you, help me. And when I heard, and the way the guy told the story to my friend was like, he was basically saying, he was like, yeah, I'm like this white guy, I'm sitting there and I'm like cutting this Indian's hair to save his life. And I was just like, on the one hand, it's funny, right? Like it's tragically funny, but at the other hand, it has like so many contradictory like elements to it, right? Thinking about historical, history and related to scalping, and history and related to assimilation with boarding schools and cutting hair. And I was like, that is like amazing. And I tried to write it as nonfiction, but I was way too far removed from the story. Maybe if I had been the one who found him, on the, but it didn't work as nonfiction. And it was only after a first draft of Night of Living Rez that I wrote Burn, out of despair for, thinking the book had not worked, and thinking the book had failed, which it was failing at that point. But yeah, I wrote that as fiction, and it just worked. And it's this story, thanks to hearing that story, that I met Dee and Felis, really.
Wow. That's cool. And I just want to say to the crowd, and I see people are already doing it. We're already getting questions in the chat, and so please keep that going. React, ask any questions you like, and we will go to as many of those as we can once Morgan and I have a chance to talk a little bit more. And I saw actually what made me think of this next question is what somebody said in the chat asking about humor, and that was something that I wanted to ask about too. And it's wrapped up in what we were just talking about, like this moment with the hair. It has humor, but also like all these things wrapped up together with that. And I was thinking about, there's so many what we might call hard situations, real situations in this book. There's addiction, and there's violence, and there's a lost baby, there's grandmother not recognizing her grandson. There's these really hard moments, but there's so much humor and compassion also in the way that the characters are treated, I think, by you as the writer, but also maybe, I don't know, there's the stories, I think, just have a compassionate way about them, and along with that humor. And I was curious about, how much you feel like is those things, that humor and compassion, are those things that kind of come naturally to you think, as a writer, or like do you feel like you had to like really carefully calibrate the mix of those things in as you revised and worked and hammered away on these stories over time?
I think that's a great question. I think, you know, the idea of compassion has always been, I think, one of my core principles as a person. But I also find that the best fiction and the best nonfiction or the best stories are the ones that are compassionate, or are able to find compassion in the darkest of places. Even if it's just a tiny glimmer of compassion, like those are the stories for me that are transcendental, you know, that come so close to like encountering something new. And in writing the stories, I always, since that was so sort of ingrained in me, it was kind of like second nature, you know. That's not to say I always wrote that way. You know, growing up, I read a lot of writers who were, you know, there are tons of writers out there who prey on, you know, who victimize characters in order to create emotion and chaos and you know, basically to sell their work. And I wrote certainly like that at times in my developing years. And but eventually I came to recognize that it wasn't what I wanted to do. And, you know, I began to see that I could do so much more if, you know, I didn't victimize people, if I made them, you know, if I didn't start there. Like, I think like that's the big thing, is a lot of writers who approach it that way start with the tragedy. You know, they start with, you know, what's bad. You know, they don't think about the mundane, minute things in, you know, in the peripheral. And for me, it's always been like, when I start a story, like it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't. And I think this is what has made people relate to the book a lot. This, at least this is my opinion, is that as a writer, I don't go to the, you know, there are things I follow when I write, you know, but I want every story's foundation to be the one thing that unifies us all. And the one thing that we all have in common, regardless of background, regardless of ethnicity, all of that stuff, the one thing we have in common is that we all can feel, right? We can all have emotions. We all can experience that. It's just that we don't have the same experiences that elicit those emotions. So it's like starting a bit more with emotion and thinking about those, and then building on top of that I'm able to kind of get away or circumnavigate, you know, that idea of misery porn type literature. And as for humor, you know, I think it's just sort of like the second nature thing. Like, I mean, I guess I'm funny. Like, I can be funny, but I'm not like David Sedaris. You know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between writing satire, or there's a difference between a piece being humorous and a piece having humor.
Right.
You know, and so for me, I've always just looked for opportunities to make myself laugh. You know what I mean? Like, to think about, okay, if I were in this situation, what would I find funny right now? Because, you know, in my own experience, you know, my family coped as most people do with you know, finding humor in, you know, the darkest of places, right? You're broke, your oil's almost gone. What do you start cracking up about? You know what I mean? It's kind of like mom character in Food for the Common Cold at the end, where she's just laughing hysterically, right? Like, that's the type of, you know, humor I was used to. And again, it kind of came second nature, but it was about finding the right time to put it in.
That makes sense. Yeah, you are naturally funny on social media, I have noticed.
Okay, good.
But we don't need to talk about social media tonight, I don't think. What about let's talk a little bit about, you know, you set this book in a real place, obviously a place that you know well, and, you know, a place that you want the readers are going to see, understand to some degree, whether they know anything about it or not, recognize it to some degree if they know it. How much did you struggle during the writing with like what to include and what to not to include about the place that you're writing about? knowing that, thinking about sort of like the ethics of writing a real place?
Yeah, I don't, that's a great question because for the longest time, I refused to name the people in the book, to name the tribe they were from. Like if you go through the book, I think you see Penobscot, which is Penobscot, which means Penobscot, and then you see mention to the Penobscot River, and maybe there's one other mention of Penobscot. Um, Maybe even Wabanaki, I'm not sure. But for the longest while, I was kind of like, I want to have this be a nameless tribe. And I didn't quite know why. I think I was after some type of argument, right? I think I was trying to tackle argument over story. And so I remember the first agent the first agent I had who, it didn't work out between us. We got a divorce. But I remember her asking me because the version I'd sent her kept it ambiguous. It was just called the island. It was never called, the Penobscot Nation or anything like that. She was like, one of the very first questions she asked me when we were talking was, "Are you a Native American?" Because she couldn't tell. There was because most Native people write specifically about their tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why I was, not wanting to name it. I don't know, maybe I was afraid of like putting a target on my back for writing about, people, but eventually I was like, well, this is my experience, and it's like I can write, whatever I want. And the moment I did that, the moment the work opened up, the moment I did that, I felt not constrained by wanting to convey some idea about Indian country, so to speak, right? And I was able to get specific with Penobscot, and I will say this as a disclaimer that even though the book says this is about Penobscot people, it's really not. It's about like 6 Penobscot people, and this hopefully one day, there's a book that is sort of like an antithesis to this, that counteracts it, that is completely different, that shows a different side. But being specific, is just, I think especially for Native writers, like it's such an important thing that we're specific with the tribes that we're writing about, because the more specific we are, the more chances we have to, I think, increase, American and global readership's understanding of, tribes in the US. Because if you ask people, oh, have you ever heard of the Penobscots? And like, oh, I have no idea. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, this is one of the first books really in mainstream literature that, introduced readers to Penobscot characters. Gregory Brown's The Lowering Days did, I think, when it came out 2 years ago or so. But there hasn't been any, Penobscot characters. And so I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to go. I don't care. And nobody's egged my car when I've driven around on the island or anything yet. So.
That's great. That's really, really cool. What about, as I was rereading the book today, I was also thinking about order. How did you figure out what kind of, how did you think about sort of the arc of this book? Because the stories are, I think probably a lot of people on the call have read the book. They're not in a chronological order, right? But there is an order. I think that, well, you talk about it. What were you going for, with the way that the stories ended up appearing?
Yeah, I didn't know what I was going for until I recognized it. And then the work really occurred. But no, I wrote, so I'll just shorten the version because I feel like I over tell this story all the time. But the first version of Night of the Living Rez that existed was only featured David. It did not have Dean Fellis, and it started with In a Jar, and it had 10 stories. It started with In a Jar, and it ended with Night of the Living Rez, and a version of Night of the Living Rez that isn't as dramatic as the one that's in the book. And so I set out to do, like, I had a couple stories already told from David's point of view. I had Night of the Living Rez, I had Smokes Last, I had another story, It's All There, which was a very premature, very different version of The Blessing Tobacco. And I was like, all right, well, if I'm going to write a story collection, how about my scaffolding was like, let's move chronologically. Let's just start with David as a boy and then move all the way to Night of the Living Rez. And so I did that. I wrote like 15 stories, 16 stories, and I chose what I thought were the 10 best, and I put them together chronologically. And I looked at the book and I was like, this sucks. Like, this is not good. And it wasn't that the stories themselves weren't good. It was that it became the same thing over and over again. It was neither a competent traditional story collection, nor was it a competent interconnected story collection. And insofar as that, it wasn't a traditional story collection because it didn't have different stories with different settings and different characters and different situations. It featured the same character 10 times in the same place with the same people, right? Almost more sounds like a novel, right? And then it wasn't an interconnected story collection because it didn't really have what I would call the underground arc. And the way I've come to understand interconnected story collections is that, a novel has a power line you can see like above ground, whereas the interconnected story collection, you can't see it, but it's buried, right? And it's like Finland, all the power lines are under the ground, but they're there and they're there, and it's supplying power and it's fueling the book in some obscure way that isn't detracting you from the individual stories. So that's what I knew what I always wanted to do, was to write an interconnected story collection that was connected and wasn't a novel, but was being fueled by something. And that first shot failed, and I didn't know how to fix it or whatnot. So I would just screw it, and I was like, whatever, this book failed, I'll move on, I'll go do something else. And that's when I said, I told you I wrote Burn. I went and wrote Burn, and I was, in my mind, I was like, these are completely different characters. It's in the same world, but it's completely different characters. It's not David, none of them. And I've been hearing this name in my head, Fellis, over and over and over again. I don't know where it came from. And I'd had the story of the guy with getting his hair frozen. And so I wrote Burn, and there's the line in there that goes, where Fellis says, "Get me out, D." Fellis said, "D, get me out." And I knew at that line, for rhythm purposes, I needed to name the narrator. And when I got to that line, I froze, and I wanted to say David, because I'd spent, a year writing in David's voice. And I was like, no, I'm not going to. And so I didn't. And then I just put D in as a placeholder, the letter D. And time went on, I was revising, and I was like, all right, well, I want to submit this story to places. I was like, but I need to name this person. And I was like, what is this guy's name? And I was convinced it started with a D. I was like, Daryl, Darren, Dimitri, what is it? And I kept saying D over and over again until I just like looked at my keyboard and I typed 2 E's after it. And I was like, why have I been resisting this? And I was like, wait a minute. I was like, this is David all grown up. This is David, years later. And so I was like, holy smokes. And I was like, okay, I'm on to something here. And this is how I work. It's just a mess. And I started writing D and Fellis stories. And if you look, it's interesting. When you read the book, the David stories are very chronological. Like, you get a strong sense of David growing up. But with the D and Fellis stories, they're very, like, they can almost be moved around in a way, you know what I mean? Like, they're not grounded in time. I think I did put some time markers in there as I edited the book, but originally there wasn't, because I wasn't working with time. I was just free floating them. And so I wrote all these D and Fellis stories. And so I had, again, a bunch of them. And then I had all these David stories. And I was like, all right, let's do the same thing. Let's take 10 stories. So I took 5 of the best David stories, and I took 5 of the best D and Fellis stories. And I was like, what do I do with them? And I realized I was like, the power line underneath, this is basically, I think, this idea of healing, right? This idea of coming full circle and becoming whole again, even if you're still broken in a way. And so I sort of already had that, and I made it so the stories work that way. But the problem then became ordering them, right? Like, how do I do all the David stories? Do I do all the Fellis stories? But really, I just kind of like stuck to how I think of short stories is, a novel gets its power from its sheer length, whereas a short story gets its power from what's left out. And so thinking about that, like, if you take the 2 timelines, if you take the David and David timeline and the Phallus and D timeline, there's a huge gap of time missing in the middle, where if you would put it that way, you'd be like, what happened? I don't know what happened. And that's the big question, what happened, right? And you get to the end and you find out why he is the way he is. So in order to fix that, I was like, well, what if I minimize the amount of time in between? And I was basically like, all right, well, to do that, it would be a D or David story followed by, it's opposite, a David story, a D story, a David story. And I did that, and I had them printed out, and I laid them on the floor, and I was going back and forth, and the David stories were immovable. I think maybe like 2 could have been swapped in places, but for the large part, those were immovable because he was at a certain age. But the D and Phallus stories, I could do whatever, and I was revising, and I had different versions of what the book looked like, and so it was really this like messy, organic process of like, I didn't know what it was going to be until it hit me, until I was like, whoa, it was like I fell asleep and woke up, and there it was.
That's a really cool story about the structure of it. Did you did you have to, was there a moment, I mean, we seem to need to learn like every few years that like we can read short story collections, like, I mean, I know fiction writers and readers read them all the time, but like, I'm talking about like a larger readership, certain collections like back, looking back through the decades, like Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad or Olive Kittredge, and this one, I mean, frankly, so many people are reading it. So it's good. I'm glad we're being reminded of that again. Were there moments where you had to resist a call to either internally or externally to try to make this a novel?
Yeah, I think, near the end of its like finished product, I had agents be like, we'll turn this into a novel and we can sell it. And I said this earlier today to somebody, but I had tried to do that. I was like, all right, I'll give it a shot, because I was desperate. And the more I tried to turn it into a novel, the more the stories began to break. It was almost like a 2x4 putting too much pressure right in the middle of it. And so I was like, no, it's not going to happen. And I just said, screw it. I said, if you're not going to take it as a story collection or as an interconnected story collection, then whatever, so be it. And it sat there collecting dust until a friend, their agent read it and was like, I love it, let's sell it. And that is Rebecca Friedman at the Rebecca Friedman Literary Agency. And she's been my agent ever since and has always championed my work. But yeah, she was like, these are stories. She's like, I totally see what you're talking about. And Tin House also saw it that way. Maisie Cochran, my editor, was like, these are stories. And we were on the same page. We were like, we want to nurture this in a way where, the arc of the book is suggested rather than implied, and I was grateful for that. And so there was pressure externally. Internally, there wasn't very much of it until that external was like, you need to do this if you want to have a successful book. But yeah, I knew from the very beginning that it wanted to be stories.
Yeah. Do you feel like this might be a hard question to answer. Feel free to not answer it if you don't want to, but do you feel like some of these characters might reappear, like you might consider them in a story down the line, or do you think you've like written the stuff that needs to be written about them?
I think one day I'll come back. I'm really drawn to mainly to Paige and to Phallus as two characters. I'm working on a book, right? Well, by working, more like dreaming about, but I've already started a draft of it, but I haven't returned to it for a while. But it features all women, and it's a novel called the Year of the Frog Clan, and it's about this woman who's trying to regain custody of her children for what will be the last time. Like if she screws up, she loses her parental rights. And I see that main character as being Paige in a way, and she's not named Paige, but I see, and I think readers might recognize sort of like a resemblance there. But so there's that, and then there's Phallus, who I really don't know a lot about. Like I don't like. It's funny, people like I'm the writer, I can say what make up whatever I want, but really I try to be on the reader's level. Like I like to not know what's going on. Like, because if I get surprised, I'm like, oh, and then the reader's surprised. But with Fellis, I have no clue what is going on with him. Like even like in Get Me Some Medicine, I think when he won't even tell David that he like dropped out of school, you know. So he's very secretive. Like he's like a cat, you know. He keeps his cards close to his chest, and so he's someone I could see myself writing more about. But in my novel that's coming out next summer, there is a mention of Dee and Fellis, not by name, but an incident occurs. And they later find out in the news that the narrator says something like, yeah, it was the two knuckleheads who tried to rob the tribal museum or something like that. So they do make an appearance in this like Faulkner type world I'm creating or hope to create.
Right on. That's great to hear. Can you say anything else about the novel that's coming out next summer?
I can, yeah, but it might not be coherent. I've yet to write the synopsis, and I'm afraid to. But it's called Fire Exit, and it'll be out in the summer of 2024. So I feel like soon they should have covers, and I think eventually they're going to start gearing up the publicity train for it. But it's multi-generational novel. The narrative is strictly set over the course of like a year and a half, but it has one narrator whose name is Charles. I came up with this name before I named my son Charlie. Like I did. Charles existed way before Charlie did. No parallel there. And the book really tackles blood quantum. For those who are unfamiliar with blood quantum, federally recognized tribes have to keep track of members of the tribe, and it's up to the tribe on how they want to do that. The most common method, I think, is blood quantum, which is, you know, if you have a certain amount of Indian blood, you are considered a member. So for the Penobscot Nation, it's 25%. So if you have 25%, you're considered a member of the tribe. You're considered Penobscot in the eyes of the federal government. So this story is about Charles, he was like 2 years old, and his mother married in to the tribe, who was non-native, and he grew up there. He was raised on the reservation. His stepfather Frederick was, always, going to council meetings and like, pushing back against what would eventually become the Settlement Act. And there's all this drama and political stuff too, but really the narrative is set in present day. It's like 2017, and Charles, the book starts with the line, "I want the girl to know the truth." And he's talking about the girl across the river and who is on the Penobscot Nation. And that girl is actually his daughter. And that years ago, he and his daughter's mother, Mary, she got pregnant. They had the child, but she was a quarter blood and he had no native blood. And she wanted her daughter to be considered native. So she lied and said that Elizabeth, their daughter, belonged to a native man, so she could be on the census. So he watched his daughter grow up across the river, and he's telling this story, and there's all this stuff in between, and he's rekindling his relationship with his mother, who has suffered from severe depression her entire life and blames her son for her husband's death, Charles's stepfather. And eventually he comes to see that his daughter might have inherited her grandmother's illnesses. And so he's building up the courage to talk to her and to like tell her all the stories she doesn't know she belongs to. And so it's like, that's my best way of describing it. I'm dreading having to sit down and write the synopsis, because it's like, oh dear God, how do I say this?
That's the worst part, was writing the synopsis, right?
It is, yeah. It's not even the word. Yeah, writing the book's the easy part. The synopsis is the hard one.
I'm going to ask maybe a couple more, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. I was wondering, did you have any specific books that were kind of touchstones by other people that you were thinking of as you were working on Night of the Living Rez? I mean, I'm sure, I know
Yeah.
you're a reader and I know you're always reading stuff, and I'm sure there's lots of different kinds of influences, but
Yeah, there I mean, I always loved I kind of, whenever I found myself struggling to achieve something in a story, I turned to my teachers, Anton Chekhov, Alice Munro, Raymond Carver, the people who really nurtured me and taught, or whose books taught me, to write. But then I found myself reading, this is why it's so important to read contemporary work as a writer, because you'll find that writers are achieving things you're struggling with. Or if you have questions, you'll sometimes be like, you'll encounter a writer who's like, oh, or you'll encounter a work and you'll read it and you're like, oh, this answers my question I had. For example, I had this particular uneasiness in The Name Means Thunder, about how absent Paige is in the story, how sort of quiet she is and not really there. And I was reading Jamel Brinkley's A Lucky Man at the time, and I can't remember the name of the story, but there was a story that had a really prominent character in it that was like not there, like was not present in the story yet, had a lot to do with them, and had to do with a particular violence, and there was no voice for them, there was no sort of like agency, and I was like, I don't know. For me, I was like, well, Jamel Brinkley can do it, I guess I can do it. It was okay. But I remember that as a specific thing. And if you haven't read A Lucky Man by Jamel Brinkley, I highly recommend it. And his newest story collection, Witness, which just came out, which is phenomenal. So definitely pick that up.
right on, right on. All right, one more from me, and then we'll go to some from the audience. I'm wondering, I mean, you've been riding quite a wave in the last, what is it? Has it been 2 years since the book
It's been
came
a
out?
year and a month.
A year and a month. Oh, it's only been a year. Gosh, it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's just been so much well-deserved attention. Finalist, we heard the long bio. That's all, that stuff is real. People are reading this book, um, which I imagine must feel really, good and gratifying, and people picking it up. I wonder also, as a writer, as you're working on new stuff, how much have you had to really work to like push that stuff aside when you go back to the blank page, or is that not an issue for you? I know it's something that others have struggled with in your shoes.
Yeah. It is an issue that writers do struggle with. I was actually talking to Jim Shepard about that, and when I went down to New York for an event, and he had some wise words to say. But I think I spent so long just writing and getting rejected that it's kind of like, I don't know. I eventually kind of recoiled back into like, all right, I've built up two sides. There's the business of writing and there's the art of writing. And like right now we're in the business of writing, talking about the art of writing. And so like I've learned how to sort of navigate those two well, I think. Um, we'll see as we keep going. But I mean, I've done um, I've been continuing to write and to work on projects, and so it hasn't been too hard, but it during the whole year, I would say, with like events like back to back and traveling and doing that stuff, it was virtually impossible to get stuff done. I just didn't have the mental capacity to do it. I would just read or like sit in my hotel room and like stare, at
Totally.
the wall.
Yeah.
But yeah,
You were teaching that whole time too, right? I mean, you were
I
teaching.
was, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was teaching, I think, 2 or 3 classes or something like that. No, I was teaching 2 classes and then 3 classes. So for the fall and spring. So I was busy. Yeah, so it was crazy. This is the first summer I've had off in years because I did the adjunct grind, and yeah, so
And you had a baby, so
yeah,
yeah, you haven't really had it off, but it's been a lot of good stuff. So
yeah.
um, cool. Let's pull in some questions from the audience here. So Tawny wrote, I love this book. I like the format. It did bother some in my book group, the format, she writes. Can you talk about the connected short stories format a little bit?
Talk about the bothered some in the book group part. No, I actually went to a book group. I went to a book group, and there was like a dozen people, but there was one person who was outwardly like, "I'm very bothered by this book. I don't like it." But by the end, they were like, "Oh, I see what you mean there." So I'm not saying I could sway your book group, but maybe I could, or those in the book group. But yeah, the connected short stories, I think, it's this fine balance between, like I think if you look through any interconnected story collection, at least in my opinion, this is how I view it. It's, you don't want the stories to speak to each other too much. And if they do, you want to do it in very subtle, kind of like subtextual ways. I think the only story in my collection, which is Half-Life, I think that's the only story that mentions anything from the other stories. All of the other stories, I think, are pretty good at keeping them contained and or implying their connectedness. So, like, for example, in Safe Harbor, spoiler alert, when D gets in the car accident and he like mangles his leg up real bad, that's never mentioned again, right? But when you're reading Earth Speak, Fellis asks D to drive, and D goes, "I hate driving," and he goes, "I scratched at my leg," and it's just this tiny little, nod to that other story, saying it without saying it. And so that to me is like how we build connected short stories, is not because the moment we have them collapse all together, the moment we have sort of like a novel or something that is like begging to be more novelistic, if it has that engine. Or we have that first draft of my version of this book, which was terrible, and it was neither one or the other. But yeah, that's sort of how I see connected short stories in their format. Not having them lean too much on each other. Each story should get its power from itself, so to speak.
I loved what you said too earlier about there being an underground power line sort of under the whole thing. I think that makes a lot of sense, thinking about how do we think about these things.
Yeah, it's the only way I can make sense of it. It's like no one ever really talks about like what makes an interconnected story collection. It's just this thing between a traditional story collection and a novel, or people will be like, "Oh, it's a half-ass novel," or you know what I mean? Like there's no real definition for what this thing is, but hopefully one day there will be, because there's a lot of them coming out.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. I think you already, there's a couple of these that you already answered, things you already talked about. Let's see. Somebody writes, the stories are so harsh and sad, and yet there's a type of humor too. How did you manage that?
Yeah, again, I think it was always like, when I'm writing and I'm like revising and reading, the stories and trying to see what else needs to go into it, I feel the tension and I feel, things boiling up as a reader would. And I'm like, and I kind of come at it as a reader. I'm like, oh, it would be cool if this happened. You know what I mean? Like that, like this is what I'm expecting. And like, so I would try to find the humor in that way. I think just, I don't know, being irreverent. I love irreverency. I think it's just a necessary aspect of living a good life. Being able to joke about, stuff. And I think there is an immense amount of harshness and sadness in this book, but the humor, I think, is what alleviates that ache and makes it manageable to get through to the end, where, in my view, hopefully it's not as painful anymore.
Yeah. This is more of a comment, but I'll read it. Lauren writes, I read this book 2 times and then listened to it a 3rd time. When I first read the book, I was confused by the order of the stories. My second reading gave me a greater understanding of the characters and the chronology, and then listening the 3rd time brought it all together. So there you go. You just have to stick with it.
It's interesting. Yeah, some people don't get the connection, and it's like it's not a reader, well, maybe it is a reader fault, I don't know, but like when I sold the book to Tin House, like when you sell a book to a publishing house, everybody at the publishing house like reads it. And there were a few people who were like, who's D, like Dave, like that doesn't, and then when they were like, oh, it's the same, someone was like, it's the same person, they're like, oh, like they, you know, they didn't get it. And I don't, you know, I don't say it. I think it's in Earth Speak is the only time the name David appears with D, and it's a D story, and it's at the very end when he's fighting with his mom about getting him a spoon. So then go back to Ralph Nelson's house, and she calls him David, and that's the only time, and it's there, I promise. So there is evidence. There's textual evidence that it is David.
Susan writes, do you ever hit an obstacle when you're developing a story, something that just stops you by clouding where you're going? If so, what's your process for getting past that?
Yeah, I think my biggest obstacles are, and this is gonna, hopefully this doesn't sound like too like I'm very fortunate, because I don't see this as a fortunate thing, but the biggest obstacle I hit is the amount of directions a story can go in. Like that's the problem. I think a lot of people talk about, you know, writer's block and not knowing where to go. For me, it's always like, or people who have writer's block, like, I don't know where to start. For me, it's like, which one of these paths do I take? You know, for me, when I always tell my any writer I work with, whether, you know, they're developing writers, you know, seasoned writers, you know, for me, it's always like, all you have to do is have a character do something. And if they do something, there's a consequence to that, or consequences. And then your job is, you know, to find the right one and travel down that path, right? And then really we're talking about plot here and thinking about character and all of those things. And so when I feel, and I won't lie, I have felt stuck before, like not knowing where to go, how to get started. But my method has always been, all right, let's just get a character. Let's have them, you know, rob a bank. They rob a bank. What happens? Do they get caught? Do they get away? If they get caught, what happens? If they get away, what happens? You know what I mean? And it's just this rabbit hole. And I'm not saying you should plot stories. You know, I don't plot stories, but you can plot stories. But that's my way of sort of, you know, getting past, you know, being stuck. I had a professor once say that writer's block is just depression. I don't agree, but I thought that was funny.
My favorite writer's block moment, which I think is well, Phil Levine was the poet who said it to me, but I think he was scribbing from somebody else. But he basically just says, if you have writer's block, lower your standards. Like basically, like be willing to write worse. You know, just like anyways. So let's see. Oh, Rachel, I was going to go to Rachel's question, writes, when I first started reading the book, I thought In a Jar happened chronologically after Burn, and that Felis's hair was the hair in the jar. I was wondering if you did that on purpose.
I did not do that on purpose. You know, it's so funny what people see in books, and it's like, where were you when I was working on this book? Because that could have been like, you know, that could have helped me immensely. But no, that wasn't done on purpose. But putting Burn first, I did do that actually on purpose, because I didn't want readers to, this is like, now I'm talking business of writing. I'm like, I didn't want readers to like pick up my book and see that the first story was like 30 pages long. I wanted them to pick up the book and see that they could read the first story, you know, standing there in the bookstore. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And it worked out well that way. But I like that idea of Felis's hair having beat. Now it's like all like time travel-y wormhole stuff I'm thinking of right now. Right. But no, it wasn't done on purpose. Wasn't done on purpose. But that's an interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can totally see why you put Burn first. It's such a striking way to start, and it is a shorter story. It's a great entry point, you know, for the collection. So Lucas writes, when working through your stories, do you utilize any writers groups or others to help you find the final form, or do you prefer to trust your own instincts to work it out eventually?
I've never done writers groups. I mean, I've done like workshops. I went through my MFA program and everything, but it's just, when I first started writing, I had a teacher who taught at Eastern Maine Community College. His name was John. His name is John Goldfine. He's retired now, but he was my first mentor. You know, he was the person who taught me the most. You know, that I could learn about writing. And you know, I took his nonfiction courses, and it was always very individualized feedback. You know, we'd have long conversations about fiction and nonfiction. And so that was sort of my foundation and introduction into learning creative writing. It wasn't this mass, like, let's all sit in a room and talk about your story type thing. And so today I'm not in any writers groups. I have, you know, 2 or 3 trusted people I can turn to be like, hey, what do you think of this? I don't always turn to them. Sometimes I'm just like, this is it. And, you know, I'll send it to my agent, who is a very good reader, or my editor. And they're like, yeah, this is great. Let's just, you know, change a couple things. But when it comes to the bulk of actually like getting 85% of the work done, you know, getting to that point, I work on it myself. I'm very private with that.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Lisa's wondering, can you talk a bit about Felix and his distrust / jealousy / rage around higher education, and his own rage about his community college experience?
You see, I wish I could, because, you know, like I was mentioning earlier, you know, like Felix is this character who, like, I feel like is not done. You know, in a novel, I wouldn't be able to get away with that, I don't think. But in the short story form, it's like you can leave things out. Like there can be that void, right? There can be that absence. And with Felix, you know, I really don't, and I'm not trying to dodge the question here at all, but like I haven't really gone down that road. Like I don't know, you know, why he is so distrustful. I don't know why he's jealous. I don't know of Miku, you know, and I don't know why, you know, he does what he does. You know, there's, you know, I really don't know. There's something about him that is like, I couldn't catch him. Like I just, like, he was so hard to pin down. And even when you pinned him down, he still managed to escape me. Like there's so much I don't know about him. And maybe one day I'll be able to grapple him, you know, in story form. Like I can't even, I don't think if I wanted to, I could even write a first person story from Felix. Like he's that hard to like, he's like Magneto when he wears like the thing on his head, and Dr. Xavier can't like access his brain. Like that's the situation I'm in with Felix. Yeah. He's wearing this like thing over his head that I can't get into. So I wish I could answer that question, but I mean, maybe from like a literature standpoint, I could say, you know, I think, you know, his, you know, he obviously doesn't have a father figure. You know, he's obviously very angry about something. And I think that's a large part of this book is anger. And I think characters' inability to articulate that anger, to being able to talk about it. And Felix is a really big example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was just thinking as you were talking that, you know, that is certainly true. Probably, we probably all know people, not exactly like that, but people who are really hard to pin down, that you never feel like you understand what they're about or where things are coming from. They hold their cards close to the vest. They don't reveal, you know, like there are always people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we got a question from Facebook from Amy. Amy writes, earlier you mentioned David Sedaris and just now mentioned nonfiction. How did you decide to write fiction and short stories rather than essays? And somebody else asked also a question about memoir in the comments earlier, like the book reading a little bit like memoir at times.
Yeah. I started writing from a nonfiction point of view, sort of like memoir. I mentioned John, my first mentor, and the classes I took with him were all nonfiction. And I wrote memoir, and I eventually found myself in positions where I was like, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? Or like, wouldn't it be cool if, so and so had said this instead of that, and then therefore this would happen? And I found myself moving into, obviously the ethics of writing honestly and truthfully. And I found myself moving over to fiction. And so I've that's what I love about fiction is I can keep, a pinky in the real world, right? Like I imagine there's this line here, and I might have my pinky in the real world and then the rest of me in the fictional world, or I might be a little bit more in, crossing that boundary. And I always point to two examples in the book. Earth Speak, there's nothing nonfiction about that. Like I never robbed a tribal museum of root clubs. I don't know anybody who did. The only element of that is actually nonfiction is the opening image, which I think I talked about earlier, which was the webworms and the crooks of brown branches. Having seen that image, and I use that as a means to get the story going. That's the only thing that's nonfiction. But then you get a story like Safe Harbor. 3/4 of that story is accurate, is true. My mother suffered severe depression and would find herself in crisis stabilization units, and I would go and visit her, and we'd drink coffee. And on that one day, I did see her have a seizure, which was one of the most terrifying things ever. That day there was an exterminator there, walking around collecting black boxes. There was a whiteboard with a blue marker with the quote, a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. There was a woman who wanted me to bring her cigarettes, but I didn't. But I never got into a car accident after her. You know what I mean? So it's like building upon that. But, how do I decide to write fiction and short stories rather than essays? I think it's the content. I think it's, what I want to do. I write, when I want to write about people, then it becomes nonfiction. So The Gambler, which is a story that's on Narrative Magazine, is about my dad, and that's, nonfiction. And I would want to be honest, I would want to be as honest about those stories as possible. Whereas in fiction, if I want to make some stuff up, then I could change it. And actually, if you actually want an example, you can look at The Gambler, which is in Narrative Magazine. And there's another story called A Thin Smoke Rises, which is published somewhere, which is like a fictionalized version of my father's ultimate death and how we had left things off. So that you can compare the two. It could be interesting to see.
Yeah, wow. Cool. Morgan, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you and hear about your work some more. So thank you for doing it. Thank you to everybody out there. We're at an hour, so we are gonna wrap it up here. If you're interested in reading Lungfish, A Night of the Living Rez, or anything else, make sure you connect with your local library or bookseller. We'll also be announcing next year's recommending author at the beginning of September. So this we got some exciting news for next year coming up. But thanks again, Morgan, for doing this, and thanks to
everyone.
audience.
Thanks, Gibson. Thanks, Morgan.
Thanks for all your great questions.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Have a great night.
Have a great night, everybody.
All right. Take care.